That's all you. Hi, everyone. This is Dark Journalist. Thank you so much for being here. We have a really exciting show for you tonight. I'm very pleased to have with us John Greenewald from the Black Vault. John?
It's great to be here. Thank you.
John's done some outstanding work, and we're going to get into it. In particular, we're focusing in the beginning here on the Tom DeLonge story and the AATIP program and some of the amazing information that he's dug up on that. John, with the Black Vault, has become known as basically the master of the Foia request. And we have Alexandra Bruce joining us from Forbidden Knowledge TV. Alexandra?
Hey, how you doing?
It's good to see you.
See you.
It's Friday. It's TGI Friday. And Alexandra, we're here with John from the Black Vault.
Hello, John.
Hi.
Alexandra's definitely familiar with your work. We talk about it often.
Oh, I've been familiar with it since I get 2000, or you've been online. You've had a site since then, haven't you?
Yeah, I started the Black Vault when I was 15 years old, and that was back in 1996 when I started it.
Right.
So
I heard about it then. I heard about it then from my Glenn Pruitt. He told me about you, this teenager who had a website called Black Vault. That's so wild. It's you.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
The other thing is that you continue to build it, and now it's one of the greatest resources. If somebody wants to go find documents on different UFO cases, or as I found out when I was doing the JFK special in November, it was a fantastic place for when those records came out. You posted them and you kind of made it easy to navigate right on the site.
Yeah, the government loves to take all this information, put it out online in like the most difficult and complicated way usually. And yeah, like you said, what I did was I took those JFK documents, converted them all to a actual searchable PDF file, then created a massive database out of it. I mean, there's, hundreds of thousands of pages that you can search, but it's always frustrating because, you want to make it accessible to people. And sadly, the government always doesn't do that. And so that's what I intended to do with that database.
Do you think it's intentionally obfuscated?
Well, yeah, I mean, partially because the harder you make it to navigate, the harder it is to write the stories, the slower it will be. The other thing too is, you can take these gems, the 1 or the 2 or the 10 pages that are really the nitty gritty material that we want, and hide them in 100,000 pages. And that's part of in my opinion, that's part of the game, where then you take those gems, the government can say, hey, we released it, but they pretty much hide them in a pile of 100,000 pages, and it's not like they give you bookmarks and highlights and do the work for you. You or we or me have to sift through that and figure out what the story is. So yeah, I think that's all part of the game. Make it a little bit trickier. How hard was it to create a searchable PDF? Well, when you're scanning that much material, actually not really, so they should have done that. They should have made an easier database, and they didn't. And so that's where I came aboard and just tried to get the data as fast as I could. In some cases, the data dumps literally took 5-6 days of 24-hour computer processing to do it. If they did it along the way, it would have been a lot easier, but sadly they didn't. So yeah, it's a lot of work, but I think it's all part of the game.
It's fascinating because it's such a valuable service too when you get into these things, because you have news organizations that will tell you, here's the direct link off to the National Archive, but it is so convoluted when you get into those situations. And
it is.
Yeah.
And government databases are just about as hard to understand as the government itself. When I started this at 15, I was filing FOIA requests to agencies I had never even heard of before. And most people, walking the streets, if you start asking people, hey, have you ever heard of this agency or that agency? A lot of them wouldn't hear of half or 3/4 of the intelligence agencies out there. And I think it was the National Reconnaissance Office, or maybe I think it was the NRO. But anyway, when Barack Obama was on the campaign trail, this was quite a few years ago, but somebody had asked him a question, and President Obama had responded back. Again, he was a senator at the time. Well, what do you do? And the guy says, well, I do X, Y, and Z at the National Reconnaissance Office. And he says, wait, what's that? And so it's like a sitting senator at the time didn't even know what some of these intelligence agencies were, and I could be wrong on the NRO. It may have been the NGIA, but regardless, it was an intelligence agency in the government that he was trying to head. And even he didn't know it. So I'm not saying there was anything wrong with that, and I'm not trying to make it political, but what I'm saying is there's so much out there, that we just never hear about. We know the keywords like CIA and NSA and FBI, but a lot of people don't dig past that, and there is so much out there to find.
There's no question. I had conversations with Nick Begich about this, and one of the things that he told me, and his brother and his father are senators, is that when they go into these security briefings and when they're on these House Intelligence Committees, they go into these rooms, they hear about technology that they know nothing about. And they're not allowed to take notes. They have to kind of take the word of the person they're talking, who's talking to them and giving them the briefing. 45 minutes later, they're out, and that's it. So they treat them kind of like an 8th grader. And in the meantime, there's this whole apparatus, and they're like, well, hey, we briefed Congress on it. So, it's a very interesting process. It's easy to kind of obfuscate when you're in that situation of doling out the information. But in the case of, for example, the JFK records, those are records that are 53 years old. So for them to be continuing to obfuscate those types of records tells you a lot about what they want to keep out of the public's reach there on the CIA and FBI side.
Yeah, and there's still a lot more, and they've admitted that and they're trying to be transparent, and I give them credit. I'm sure they're, buried in paperwork and requests from the media and people like me who don't give up, where we ask questions and try and push. So I try to be sympathetic to that. But in the same respect, it's like, you're right. They are 50 plus years old. So it's like, we'll release it already. What's really that classified at this point? Because most of the generations or most of the people that were involved have died off. We're in a different generation. We're in a different era. We can handle more. We know the government has done cruddy things in the past that they've admitted to. I'm not saying that they, quote unquote, killed JFK, but what I'm saying is there's something there that they don't want us to see. So what exactly is it? One last note, though, classification is a very interesting thing, because you'd think with the passage of time that all these things could just be released to the public, that they can be declassified after 40, 30, 20, 50, 60 years. I've actually found documents that are still classified from World War I. Wow. So if you can, even after a review in 2015, 16, 17, in the last few years, where I've requested these documents, again, going back to before World War II, to World War I and a couple of years after, that they still have these things classified, and they still do not believe that we can see things prior to 1930. That to me is fascinating. Wow. And it really kind of shows you what the government truly wants to hold from us. I was able to get a list of all the classified documents at an agency called the Defense Technical Information Center. And I requested everything prior from, forget exactly what date, but it was like somewhere in the 60s. Everything prior to that, all the way to the beginning of when they were handling reports. And I asked for the titles of every classified document that they have. And I was surprised that they actually gave me the list. And there were thousands of pages of documents that were classified from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. So secrecy is a very interesting thing. And sadly, it's not just the passage of time that allows them to tell us all about it.
There's no question about it. And some records that are coming up, for example, about Rudolf Hess, that have never been released, that's World War II. So yeah, certainly they go back beyond the Kennedy era. Kennedy era is kind of a benchmark, though, because it's when it's seemingly that full-on press for secrecy occurred, and there were various congressional committees trying to get at it in the 60s and 70s, and then in the 90s they finally got the ARRB. And that really was a breakthrough for a lot of reasons, but that they're the ones who assigned the date for October 26, 2017 to release those records. And then when that hit, they were still like, whoa, we can't release them all.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the CIA actually requested for them to be released in 2038.
Yeah.
So, God knows what excuse they come up with then.
And they'll keep finding excuses. And sadly, and a lot of people don't realize this, and this goes to really the notes that I have on lost history, which is why partially I do what I do to archive, because documents get destroyed. Even today, there are what they call records retention schedules, where not 100% of all government material is kept forever. So they can, even to this day, as long as it meets into their records retention schedule, legally destroy documents. So that's partially why I do what I do. But going backwards, before the Freedom of Information Act was ever created, a lot of these guys were writing these documents, never knowing that there would one day be a law and one day be people like me that would execute my right to access this information. So prior to that, a lot of this information was destroyed. We don't know what, the government sure has piles of classified information on JFK. We know that, that. But there are now documented instances like MK Ultra, the mind control experiments by the CIA, which is all documented fact. There's no CIA conspiracy hoopla there. I mean, it's documented that they did these pretty deep, dark mind control experiments, that Richard Helms actually was the one who led the charge on destroying those documents when he became the director of the CIA. And that was later found out and discovered by a Senate hearing that was conducted. So my whole point is, prior to the FOIA, a lot of this information, if somebody didn't want it out, or if they said, hey, we can't have this in writing, anymore, just destroy it. Nobody will ever know. And so we don't know how much data we've actually lost over the years. And that's why I do what I do with the blackvault.com is take that information and put it online. One of my biggest sections is FBI files. You name it, 1930s gangsters, serial killers, former FBI agents, celebrities. So I've got a massive collection of FBI files, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard a response from the FBI where I request a file and the file's been destroyed.
Wow.
And it's always like I know I'm sounding cheesy here, but it's just always a jab in the heart, because it's like, that's history. It doesn't matter if it's a conspiracy or not, but it's like, that's history. That's something that now they've utterly destroyed, and we never will find out what they had on so-and-so. And there's so many examples of that. And it's sad. It really, truly is, because I'm a history buff. I'm not just a, conspiracy secrecy guy. So I think that a lot of these things should be maintained and preserved, especially this day and age with, digital mediums being so inexpensive. But sadly, the government doesn't feel that way, and they destroy a lot of history. So I aim to kind of preserve as much as I can.
They can do that preemptively by privatizing everything. And I think that's been a major trend. And what we see now is that, like a lot of very nefarious government activity has been outsourced to companies like Google, like Facebook. Well, these companies wouldn't be what they are today.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be the heavyweight companies that they are if they really weren't de facto branches of the government.
Yeah.
In this case, it's private. It's proprietary. They don't have to disclose anything.
Right.
Right. That goes into another direction, which is the IP direction. That's kind of the corporate obfuscation you have going on there. And then we have the government obfuscation on the other side. It's like, obviously, we're squeezed in the middle and you get just this kind of narrow band of reality. But one of the things I want to go into here, which is fascinating, because before we get into the Robert Bigelow, Tom DeLonge,
Sure.
AATIP program, which you've done some fascinating work on and made some very interesting comments on it lately, and I really want to get to that.
Sure.
But just FOIA itself, and well, first of all, how many documents do you have on your site?
Yeah, I'm just shy of 1.8 million pages,
Really?
and so it's quite an archive. Those are all official documents that I got from the government. They're not leaked information or anything like that. I filed over 8,000 FOIA requests in 21 years. That doesn't count the follow-up letters and the appeals and so on and so forth, but over 8,000 individual requests. So it's been a long journey, and it's one that I never regretted getting into, and I'll probably, till the day I die, hopefully a long time from now, still be filing FOIA requests and annoying some of these FOIA offices.
There's no question about it. They must think, oh my God, here's this guy's coming again. He's not even using a pseudonym. He's just coming right back at us.
Yeah. No, I don't hide.
I do think it's interesting, though, because FOIA got a big boost in the 70s because the Jimmy Carter administration was so open. And many of the UFO documents, as I understand it, came out of that era when they made it not only more affordable to get them, but they opened up certain branches of government. And most of the UFO documents came from the 70s. When we moved into the 80s and 90s, apparently they started charging maximum fees for getting FOIA documents and also reclassifying documents that had already been out to the public.
Well, I'll deal with the first part first. Yeah, Jimmy Carter, obviously being a UFO witness, he did have quite an interest in it, and did push for information to be released. And arguably, yes, some did come out. The NSA material, though, was largely withheld up until the 90s and into the 2000s, where they would just say everything was classified. This is a very interesting story, which I'll make quick. But when we finally got them released, they said that there were hundreds of pages. There was a court case back in the late 70s, early 80s, and the NSA denied everything and said, no, it's classified. The court, the judge was given an in-camera top secret clearance to see the material, and he agreed with the NSA and said, nope, we can't release this. And there it, remained secret for another decade or two. When they finally came out, they were just completely blacked out or whited out, literally from top to bottom. There's some pages, and I have the entire collection. Some pages literally have like 4 or 5 words on them. The rest of the page is completely whited out. Now, under the Freedom of Information Act, you can do something very, very cool, which is called a mandatory declassification review. What that means simply is if they release something to you in 1990, that doesn't, and it's classified or blacked out or redacted, that doesn't necessarily mean those same redactions apply in 2018. So I can go back and request an MDR on the document they gave you in 1991. And so I did that with the National Security Agency UFO documents because, again, 15-ish years had passed. I figured, well, let's take a look at them again. And wouldn't you know that the NSA actually lost 100%. They just vanished of the original documents, and they lost them and they couldn't review them. The only ones they had were the redacted ones. And they said, yeah, sorry. We can't help you there. Now, they did end up reviewing the affidavit that they gave the judge, where the judge sided with them. I did get them to do another review of that, and I was able to get some of the redactions lifted. But my point is what are these documents that are blacked out, top secret, top to bottom, or whited out, which they love to use now, and they lost them all. And the likelihood of them losing 100% of those documents is pretty darn nil. So my point with this is, yes, there's been some openness. But in the same respect, there's been a lot of secrecy if you look at it. And the question mark for me has always been, well, what exactly are they hiding about a topic that they have no interest in or that they can easily explain? It doesn't make any sense. But that's the story they try and pass.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I think a lot about this court case that's going on with his Jefferson Morley from the Washington Post. Mm-hmm. He retired. He quit because he couldn't get this story out about George Janides. And in a lot of these records that he discovered, these aren't even in the JFK document dump records. This is not even from the ARRB, because no one even knew that this guy was part of the Oswald era JFK part. He was actually the liaison for the House Assassination Committee. And that court case rolls on now. It's been going on over a decade, and he wins some, he loses some. Yeah. But, in some cases, that's what it takes. He's actually suing the CIA. Now, in your case, have you ever had to sue for any of the records that you have at the Black Vault?
Yeah, no, I've taken it all the way to that point. Sadly, just, it's not cheap to get to that level. I've been very successful, happily, with appeals. So a lot of times I get denied, and I kick myself because I always didn't think I would have good luck with it. And starting about, it's been quite a few years now that I've been exercising the appeal right. But for those listeners who don't know the FOIA, it's simply that if you're denied access to something, or you believe there are records and you think they're lying, if you have any grounds to fight it, you can then file an appeal, and it goes to a different level. And, hopefully you'll win the appeal or they deny it. And so I've been pretty lucky with some of the bigger cases of winning appeals where they tell me it's classified. I appeal it. I make my case on why I believe that, their reasoning is wrong. Sometimes they deny it, but I've been pleasantly surprised. The next step after the appeal, though, is then you take them to court. And so you got a whole new ball game when you start suing, the CIA and the FBI. And, that's why when you hear about the court cases, it's like by the New York Times or Politico or, larger agencies that have the money. Right. Because, you're looking at the entire Black Vault right here. Like, it's just me, like there's no team. I don't have anybody with me, sadly. So it makes it a little bit challenging.
Oh, that's a team of specialists working back there. You can't fool me.
Yeah, they're behind the curtain. Just pay no attention to the people behind the curtain. But yeah, I wish I could, but I've taken it that far. And again, I've pleasantly been surprised with my appeals, and credit to the agencies where credit is due. I mean, they've taken my side, it's all legal letters that you have to submit. It's not like you can call them and say, hey, I think you should release this. And they go, well, okay. You know, it doesn't work like that. I mean, you literally have to write out why you feel, you know, you're disagreeing with the decision, and bring up as much case law as you can and submit it. And sometimes it takes months and years. My record is 14 and a half, almost 15 years for a document to come. I've only been doing this for 22 years. You know, imagine like waiting 15 years for something to come. That's a heck of a long time.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and I file FOIA requests almost every day. And sometimes when I file them, I think to myself, how old am I going to be when I actually get this document, or if I get it at all? But it's like, how old will I be? How many presidents will serve in the White House by the time I get this? And I wrote an article about that document that took 15 years. And it was less about the document, but more about what happened in the world, you know, on what happens truly in 15 years. And the government was, you know, quote unquote, declassifying it. Another one came where they took like 8 years. I think it was 8 years to declassify 6 pages. Wow. It took them over 1 year per page to review it and release it to me on average. That doesn't make sense, you know? Yeah. So it's humorous in a way, but very, very frustrating.
To kind of wear you down, you know, it's almost like a tape. Yeah. But just a hypothetical situation. Let's suppose someone has a relative in the Iraq War, and they were in a high position and they passed away, and they want to go get records on them and see, like, did the CIA or the FBI have a record on this person? Well, what are their odds of getting records like that?
That depends on who the person is and why they had records. But generally, when the person has passed on, even if they're alive, you can still get records. You just need their written permission to do so. So as long as, you know, they give the rights for the information to be released. This gets into what's called a Privacy Act request. It's pretty much a FOIA request, the same thing, where you request information, show the death certificate, proof of death, so on, and reasonably describe the person, social security number, age, date of birth, date of death, and see what happens. And with the FBI is fairly good. I mean, they've got a powerhouse of a FOIA office in the sense that they receive a ton of FOIA requests. So again, I try to be sympathetic to that. And if you look at the mound of files that I already have, you can see I'm probably one of their frequent requesters. They even had a list of kind of the problem people, you know, that request a lot, or, you know, are fairly on their radar, that it's like, the eye rolls, you know. I mean, they don't say it that way, but you know, that's what this
you know, you're on the list.
I am on the list. Yeah, the list got declassified and released to the public. And, you know, there's a list of about 10 people and agencies. Frighteningly, the IRS has a very similar list, which I was able to obtain on accident. I didn't know they had one, but I did a FOIA request for emails on my name in the Black Vault. And sure enough, I came up in a private exchange between IRS FOIA employees about the potential problems to releasing information to certain people and or organizations, meaning, you know, really be careful going to X, Y, and Z, because they can get media attention or get the information out there. And I was the only individual on the list, meaning it was mostly like Washington Post, New York Times, you know, this and that. And then it said John Greenwald. You know, I'm not sure if I'm proud of that, scared of that, frightened, terrified, happy. I don't know.
Well,
it's the government, obviously.
It's a badge of honor for sure. But my question is, have you ever had to get any records from Homeland Security in this whole track record?
Yeah, it depends on what branch of the Homeland Security. So back to your question. Yeah, the FBI will process for the FBI records. The CIA is real tough to get information out on people. Homeland Security, whenever you get into the law enforcement angles, to it, Department of Justice files, Bureau of Prisons. Again, I'm not real sure exactly what you might be referring to when you're going after somebody. But if they're in the military, you know, always keep in mind you can get military records. My grandfather, who sadly I never met, worked on a lot of programs with Bell Aircraft and a lot of top secret weaponry systems, the Bell X-5. He was one of the main people on. And so I did a lot of research on his background and tried to find documents and files on him and what he did, and actually found, you know, some information, reports that he wrote, some that my dad, his father was who I'm talking about, had never seen before, you know, because it was formally classified. So my whole point is, you never know what you can find. And I always encourage people that if you're researching your grandfather, your father, your brother, your sister, your mother, whomever, you know, do it. And do it widely, you know, send the FOIA or Privacy Act request to as many agencies as you can think of, because the worst that can happen is they say no. And you might be pleasantly surprised. And I was with my grandfather and quite a few other people I've requested information on.
Remarkable. Now, when you go to find out information on a UFO case, let's say a potential crash or a sighting from the past, what's the agency that you'll go to?
All depends on the year. The government is now this is before the AATIP program disclosure. Okay. So this is kind of the mindset of where I was at 8 months ago. If the sighting or something occurred after 1969, and this is a key date, the government wants you to believe that they did their UFO investigation with Project Blue Book. Okay. So from 1947 with Project Sign, Project Grudge, and later Project Blue Book, all the way through 1969, they did their UFO investigations, and after that, they have no interest in it, no records, no nothing, and they will forward you to the National Archives for the Project Blue Book collection, and that's it. Now, I bring this up because this has always been the basis of my research for the last 21 plus years, and the reason is because that's what the government wants you to believe. Now, what the documents say, and again, this is pre-AATIP, what the documents say is something completely different, even, you know, years and years ago. There are UFO documents that stretch far beyond 1969. A lot of them are still heavily classified. I can prove that they're classified top secret. I can prove that the NSA plays a game for losing them. A quick note, I did the same thing to the Defense Intelligence Agency, who has hundreds of top secret pages on UFOs. They lost all of them also, right? What are the odds that now 2 agencies have lost it? And it's all in writing, you know, with DIA letterhead and everything. And so back to your question, it all depends on the year. And then you have to investigate it in a roundabout way where, in essence, if this was a UFO crash in 75, chances are you probably won't get far trying to get information on it because, you know, they have no interest in UFOs. They say that documents don't exist. So you just kind of have to go through the blacked out documents and see if you can find a correlation. If it's 2018 in January, UFO is seen, you know, near an Air Force base or something like that. What I like to do is you go after tower logs of Air Force bases, go after, you know, radar information. So you can't just say, give me everything you have on the UFO seen on, you know, XYZ date. You kind of got to figure out other ways to maybe make references or connections, you know, to the information. The FAA is also a good source. I went after documents on the Japan Airlines UFO incident many years ago. And according to the FAA, this was another very interesting story about a cover-up, kind of a blatant cover-up, where they had documents. They claimed they sent me a letter stating that I needed to withdraw my FOIA request, and they would send me the documents outside of FOIA. Why that is, I have no idea. In 21 years, I don't think I have any other case that ever happened.
Wow.
I never received that letter. And so when I responded to them, the last paragraph said in that letter that I never got, if we don't hear from you in 30 days, we're going to destroy all the records. And that's exactly what they did.
Wow.
And so when I followed up and finally realized what happened, they destroyed everything on that UFO case from Japanese Airlines, 1692. Off the top of my head, I don't remember the flight number, but that, to me, it's like after all these years, and there were quite a few years that they've had the documents, I request them. They do some shenanigans about me pulling the FOIA request back or whatever they wanted me to do. They didn't hear back from me, and then poof, they go in the shredder. You know, that doesn't make sense. Why would you do that?
Well, what kind of democracy is that? It's ridiculous.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So,
A TED Talk, and I'm forgetting what this. It's the guy who wrote the book that became The Social Network. You know, the movie about Facebook. He said he became a UFO buff overnight. You know, he's not the typical person who would become a UFO person, but you know, he's like a Hollywood, you know, guy whose books have been turned into screenplays. But he says that now the FAA doesn't want UFO reports anymore. And
well, that's what they claim. Yeah, and that's what they claim.
and then what the commercial pilot's manual, tells you to do is to report UFO sightings to Bigelow's company.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, and now that actually makes a little bit more sense, moving forward.
Yeah. Now we put those pieces together after the whole rollout. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fairness, that FAA manual also states the National UFO Reporting Center. So they kind of give a couple different options, Peter Davenport's organization. So in fairness, there's a couple there, but yeah, it now makes sense that Bigelow Aerospace was, listed on that FAA manual. One other interesting note and I'm sure this will lead into your questioning on Bigelow Aerospace, but this is why I get fairly passionate about the reporting on the AATIP program, is let me preface all of that by saying the military itself actually had a manual, the United States Air Force, all the way into, I believe, 2012, when it was edited, that specifically mentioned UFOs, and that all Air Force pilots were mandated to report unidentified flying objects. Now, to speed forward in the story, I figured out where the documents were going, where these UFO reports were going, which was the NORAD installation. When I filed a FOIA to the NORAD installation, I realized the hard way that they are actually not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. So how convenient was it? I mean, it makes sense that UFO reports go there, but how convenient was it that they were sending it to the one place I couldn't touch it with FOIA?
Right.
The NORAD said, in good faith, we looked for documents pertaining to your request, which again were these UFO records made under called Air Force Manual 10-206 for anybody taking notes. And so 10-206 mandated pilots to report UFOs. And they said, well, we looked anyway, and we found nothing. And so they had no documents. Not a single military pilot ever submitted a UFO record under Air Force Manual 10-206. But the most interesting point of what I'm going to make is it's not subject to the FOIA because it's under United States control and Canada.
Right.
And so I called the Canadian Department of National Defense, asked them if I, as a U.S. citizen, could request information under their equivalent to our FOIA, which is called the Access to Information Act. And this guy kind of hummed and hawed. He goes, well, if the information's been released, I don't see why not. And so I told him what I was looking for. And these aren't called UFO reports. They're called CIRVIS reports, CIRVIS. And the acronym stands for Communication Instructions for Reporting Vital Intelligence Sightings. Okay, so they're CIRVIS reports. So I told the guy on the phone, who, again, was the guy that answered the phone, not a UFO office. I never said I'm a UFO investigator. I never even said my name. And I said, I'm looking for these CIRVIS reports. It stands for Communication Instruction. And he interrupts me in mid-sentence. And he says, oh, yeah, I have them right here. And he had a stack of records on the telephone, or while he's on the telephone, within arm's reach. And he was able to grab them and look at them and say, I have them. And his joke was, I like to keep these things handy. Now, why he keeps them handy, I have no idea. But I ended up getting those documents and proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that CIRVIS reports do actually exist. NORAD was lying about it. And it was the Canadian government that actually gave them to me. And on the top of a lot of these documents was NORAD. So it was like, it's black and white. You can't get away from that. So, but that's
really amazing. When I had this, I've had conversations with Paul Hellyer. He's been on the show before. And one of the things that he told me was that the way they were able to maintain the UFO secrecy was that elements in the Canadian military would speak with elements in the American military, and they would exchange information, and they would keep it out of the loop of prime ministers or presidents. Mm-hmm. Those agreements actually just, were between the militaries themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That was a way to do it.
And it keeps it off the radar. And, a lot of people ask me, well, why won't the president come clean? And why won't they do this full-on disclosure? And I simply put it, I don't believe that the president even knows. And that's not any deep, dark conspiracy thing, but the president can only deal with kind of so much at a time. So there's so many classified conversations and information and even programs and projects that are being conducted on an hourly basis that the president of the United States doesn't know about. And the other part of that may sound a little bit conspiratorial is he's too much in the spotlight. They can foul up. There's no political statement with what I'm about to say, but our current president loves to talk. So when you give him the information that allows him to make a mistake, right, that's a big problem. So that's why I think that a lot of these guys, the senators and whomever, are kept in the dark because they are too much in the limelight.
No question about it. But John, I would say it is a deep conspiracy anyway, because they don't want him to have it in the first place. So they kind of have the good excuse not to give it to him.
Yeah, no, and that's true. But let's be fair. I don't think Barack Obama knew. I don't think Bill Clinton knew. I don't think George W., whomever is truly in the know, because these guys are the front to the government, and they are the ones that are being asked the tough questions. So the less they know, the better.
Yeah, I do understand the point you're making. I think that, well, what it is, when they get into that position, and it starts with Kennedy, really, I mean, you've got Truman and Eisenhower trying to get this information. But Truman, as we know, he got quarterly briefings on UFOs. I mean, that's just a documented fact now. That's in the oral history. And so, you know, we know that at some point, and we believe it's when Eisenhower had his stroke, that regular loop slipped away, and it slipped to Nixon. And then by the time it got to Kennedy, he's completely spending half his presidency trying to get that power and authority back. But there is this struggle that happens. And you mentioned Bush there. It's interesting because during Carter's presidency, he goes to Bush and he says, I want the UFO records. And Bush says, you're not at liberty to have them. It's on a need to know basis. And he fires him. So, you know, I'm sure he wanted to fire Bush anyway, but, you know, it's a good excuse. But we do have to understand this, which is when they get in there, like you said, a guy like Clinton isn't automatically going to know, you know. As a matter of fact, they're kept out of that loop. And it seems like all of these administrations dance around the idea of getting at this UFO information and the exotic technology that's associated with it. And there have been many, you know, sort of, there's an information trail that says a lot of that information switched out of government hands and moved into corporation hands as a way to make it proprietary information that the public, like someone like you, couldn't request and get data on it, because it was no longer it was in a quasi, you know, space between the corporations and the government. You could no longer get a handle on it. Now, what I found interesting, which kind of brings us into the AATIP program, is going into Robert Bigelow, because Bigelow is partnered with a company, United Launch, which is one of Lockheed Martin's companies. So you have the major military contractor in the United States partnering with one of our big space partners. It's inevitable. Obviously, on the commercial side, when these guys are going out into space, that they're going to need the stamp of approval of the government, et cetera. But that makes everything that they say in relation to, you know, the UFO factor suspect, because they're subject, you know, in these partnerships to the same rules as Lockheed Martin. So instantly, I had big problems with the story, because I know that with Robert Bigelow, for example, he started the National Institute of Discovery Science, which was very much into studying black triangles and studying, you know, that whole aspect of cattle mutilations. And, you know, so he understands. I mean, he's been around. He was there with John Mack. He did the MIT conferences in the early 90s. This is a guy who comes out of a hotel business style background, not unlike Trump, but he has a deep obsession around the UFO space phenomena. But I think the problem is, when we get into a guy like that, he's working so close with companies like Lockheed Martin and getting money from Harry Reid, when Harry Reid's senator, for this program, that when you get to the program itself, it's very hard to tell who's, you know, what line is being towed. Are you a private individual with a private corporation giving us a private message about your research around UFOs? Or are you subject to the protections of Lockheed Martin and the secrecy of Harry Reid as Senate Majority Leader around these issues? So we have, you know, it's very hard to tell what kind of honesty we would get there, which brings us to the whole crew around Tom DeLonge's operation.
Well, and his company's subject to Foia. And, you know, because on paper, he talks about the puerile, whatever, that our attitudes about UFOs are puerile, and, you know, the government's, he's very recalcitrant against the government's stance on UFOs. But yet, as a contractor, I would imagine he'd have to abide by whatever the policy is.
Yeah, I mean, he can't just release all the records. And no, his records inside Bigelow Aerospace are not subject to FOIA.
Right.
But when you look at government contracts, you have to do something when you're contracted to the government. And that is sign paperwork. You have to submit quarterly, monthly, weekly, whatever your contract states, reports. Anything then created and submitted to the government is Foia-able, if that's a word.
Right.
But then you
Just
can touch
invented
it. Right. So yeah, I'll invent words throughout this whole process here. But then you and I can touch those because we paid for it.
Right.
Now, arguably, stuff inside Bigelow Aerospace, sure, they can argue that that's not subject to FOIA, but there are going to be those yearly reports that come in. I sound like a negative Nancy when it comes to talking about the AATIP program and Luis Elizondo. And let me preface it by saying, I think this story is great. I give credit to Mr. Elizondo for coming out with it. I think it's brave. I mean, he's obviously got some heat coming his way. He's got a lot of media attention to it, and all of that is all positive. Where my reservations then come in is exactly what was this program? Now, obviously, they were looking at unidentified aerial phenomena. They want to invent a new acronym. That's cool. It's a UFO. I know there's a push to create a new acronym to bring a new light to this research. It's UFO. UFO is a great acronym, but okay, fine. You want to call it UAPs? That's great. There was a project decades ago called Project Moondust, and this is where I believe Bigelow Aerospace comes into play, and this is where I believe the classification comes into play, and this project was called Project Moondust. Now, Project Moondust was during the height of the space race. This is all documented and proven, and Moondust would investigate unidentified objects that had fallen from space, hit the ground, were found out in a field or wherever, and they were largely crashed Soviet satellites or failed missile tests, debris from a failed missile test. And the idea behind Project Moondust was to go out and obtain this material and, in essence, back engineer it, see what's going on, try and figure out what do the Soviets use for their rockets or satellites or, whatever it might be. Now, fast forward, I think that is kind of a blueprint of the metal alloys that are being talked about in Bigelow's hangars, and let me say why I don't think this is even remotely close to being alien. You have a couple things that really support that. Number one, Mr. Elizondo is talking about it. I would guarantee that anything that is even remotely close to something alien would probably be taken fairly seriously by the government, and Mr. Elizondo wouldn't have felt the need to go. Now, I believe he's genuine. I believe that he has an interest. I believe he thinks more should be done. But I think it's indicative that maybe the program didn't find what we are led to believe. So I think that's a fairly big red flag. The other one is $22 million over the course of about 5-ish years that we know about. Do the math on that. $22 million spread between 5 years to a private organization is like nothing, right? I mean, there were programs that I can show you documents on where they spent 10 times that amount of money building a bridge in the middle of nowhere that served no other purpose other than like getting some jobs for a town.
Like a 20-year-old Boeing 777 is $300 million. So
yeah,
and
when you really,
I'm going to tell you something weird about what you just said, which is it was Senator Ted Stevens who built the bridge to nowhere, who was one of the 3 senators that approved the funding for the AATIP program, along with Daniel Inouye. So he was good at casting money into those bridge to nowhere projects. But here's an interesting thing, because you make a good point here about it all. Really, we've heard a lot of razzle dazzle around To the Stars Academy. But what do the documents show? What have you been able to find in the documents about the AATIP program?
Yeah, well, that's another issue. So when they did their press conference, the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, or AATIP, what they call it, was not announced in October. So I had filed a FOIA request in October, specifically identifying this UFO program, and also copying and pasting the testimony of Mr. Elizondo to, in essence, cut out them playing words, a word game. If I called the program the wrong name or something like that, I specifically said in the FOIA request to the Department of Defense, what information do you have on this? And what I was specifically looking for, because you can't just say, give me everything you have on this. You have to be specific. And so I was asking for mission statements. I was looking for summaries, any reports, you name it. I listed quite a few things. And it came back with a no records response. Now, Mr. Elizondo says that he worked for Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense or Secretary of Defense. Now, where I filed the FOIA request to, there will be responsive documents. Now, I don't have any doubt that the program was or wasn't real. I believe it was real. Where then my reservations come in is, why would the Department of Defense tell me that there was no mission statement, there were no reports, there were no anything that they can find? And again, I opened it up saying, this is probably not the real name, but this is the guy who was in charge. Here's his testimony. Here's how you can verify it. And so that was kind of interesting in the sense that there should be responsive documents. Now, in fairness, maybe they're lying. In fairness, maybe they don't think they have documents. I've since appealed. I've done a little bit more homework and figured out exactly what OSD component might have responsive documents. So I'll give them, give them a little bit of leeway there, that there may be something, that they can find in a different office. Now, the other FOIA document answer that I received was from the National Security Agency.
Oh, hold on.
So,
John, we're getting a little feedback on you.
Yeah, I'm getting it in mine too.
Interesting. Alexandra.
It's fine. The sound is totally fine for me.
Yeah, it's coming through my ear too.
I don't hear what you're talking about.
Oh, so Alexandra, you've got the good signal. We're getting feedback, but let's just do a quick sound check here.
Yeah, I can hear what you're talking about.
Okay. So, but your sound isn't on your machine, is it, John?
Mine, no. No, I got it in my ear.
Okay. And Alexandra, your sound is fine.
Fine. I don't hear what you're talking about.
Isn't that interesting? Okay. Well, Olivia, sound check.
Sounds off here.
Yeah, you're hearing that echo. Isn't that fascinating? Just bear with us here, everyone, because since we're recording this for posterity, hang on. Okay, Alexandra, why don't you just while we're in the interim here, just tell us about the Theresa May statement at Davos while we fix this up.
I can't tell you about that. I can tell you about Juniper, what's her name, the public policy person for YouTube, and her address last week to the Senate Commerce Committee about all the things that YouTube is doing to censor, like the algorithmic, the crazy robot censorship that's going on now, the AI censorship, the vast amount of artificial intelligence investment that they've made to actually censor things before their censors can get to it. So it's fascinating.
What about the Theresa May statement?
I didn't see the Theresa May statement.
Okay. You sent it to me, so I recall it. But she was saying how, we have to go into this era.
Oh, yeah, she's just, I'm sorry. Now I know.
Okay.
She's just, they're all doing it at the same time, so yeah, it's the same. So they're, in the same week, we have the public policy person for YouTube and Theresa May talking about the many, how important it is to censor the internet.
Right.
So when you have YouTube and Theresa May going on and on about the importance of how it is to censor, how great and fabulous censorship is, then you have to know that this is a completely globalist initiative. It's not sort of a one-off on one corner. It's like they're all coordinated.
It is really interesting. And you're getting into censorship again when we talk about this, because when we get into this censorship idea and we go into FOIA requests, now you're into social media, and they try different things like shadow banning in order to control the conversation. Of course,
so this is a whole other level of shadow banning. This is like, it's shadow banning the planet from itself. It's like
right.
Your internet searches, your YouTube searches are being filtered. And that's what they talk about. They talk about one, it's for terrorists. And so of course, anything that they roll out for terrorists can of course be rolled out for everybody. 9/11 was based, everything is blamed on, and it's the war on terrorism, but it's really the war on humans. And so they talk about this one program where they're supposedly targeting ISIS people and their searches on how to do ISIS, how to make bombs and whatever. And they're having their searches force redirect to YouTube playlists that discredit, their terrorist organizations.
See, that's very fascinating because it's a good way to control the dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but the thing is, I think that they're doing that on some level to the whole net. I mean, there's Eric Schmidt, the guy who had to step down weirdly all of a sudden, the chairman of Alphabet.
Mm-hmm.
He said, in the future, you're only going to get one, now you get like hundreds of results for your query. In the future, you're only going to get one answer.
Right.
That's
right.
a good thing.
Yeah.
How is that a good thing? I don't understand.
Well, I mean, this is the kind of Orwellian type of situation that they want to build. And, they want that double plus good sort of closing off, that less chance for a thought crime if you're using less letters there.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, and then that's what you start to see is that these corporations aren't corporations. It's a giant fascist monolith. It really reminds me of when communist China was really still communist. And I used to go to Chinatown and look for cheap stuff to buy. And I remember just that they would put these like fake brand names on things because they didn't really have private companies competing with each other to make the best soap in the market, And so you'd see like Rose brand soap. And it was like, why do they even bother putting a brand on it? It's, the state owns all the factories.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's kind of like the United States, the big companies aren't really that different from this sort of state-owned communist fascist model that I was sort of laughing about in the 90s. It's like
amazing. Well,
here.
Yeah. The thrust is for the centralization. There's no question about it.
But it's with the illusion that there's diversity and whatever, except for that you have Eric Schmidt admitting that he only wants to give you one result in the future. He's trying to get you to think that's good somehow.
Exactly. So John, I think I've narrowed it down. I unplugged my mic and plugged it back in, and I want to ask you to do the same thing just in case, because it's an echo that pops up at weird times, and who knows what it is. But if you just unplug yours and plug it back in, then we'll know we got that part done. But this is fascinating, and we're getting into the real stuff here, because when you look at it and you look at the whole Delonge rollout, not only was it a gigantic marketing op, but they were rifling these facts past the whole UFO community. And it was, basically, hey, it's Elizondo. He's got all of this information. He's a disgruntled guy. He left in 2012. He left a few days ago, even though the program ended in 2012.
Yeah.
So, we had this guy leaving in October, supposedly, hanging around for 5 years, disgruntled. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, it doesn't. And the narrative is starting to change depending upon the interview that you listen to. And so that, again, is a red flag. As time goes on, the story is starting to change.
Yeah, so tell me, what have you discovered? Because, okay, if the thing ended in 2012, and then it's October 2017, and he quits.
Right. Well, from what I gathered, and I don't speak for him, and I want to make that clear, that if I'm under some misunderstanding, by all means, correct me. But from what I gathered from seeing a lot of his interviews and reading his testimony and so on, is that the program ended in 2012. This was my initial thought and belief. Ended in 2012. He felt it should continue. He and a couple other people within the office continued to look into cases as they came in. We won't talk about utilizing company resources for that, because that was the impression that I got, that he was doing this on a personal level. And that's fine. Hey, by all means, have fun with it. But now recently, I've been hearing that 2012, it did end. And then the information was, no longer an interest. And then all of a sudden, it became funded again in 2013. And there he continued until October-ish of 2017. I'm getting the feedback back, but sorry, I did what you...
No, I was catching that a little bit. But that is a fascinating point that you're making. And let's think about this for a moment. If we get into a situation where, he was a part of this program and basically saying, oh, I ran it rogue on my own for 5 years. That doesn't make any sense either. I mean, we have to understand that Elizondo is a counterintelligence agent. I mean, so as I understand it, as Walter Bosley, who worked at the Air Force, Office of Special Investigations, he said it's very easy for him to have officially resigned, but to still be in a contract position. So that's the question that needs to go to Elizondo. Do you have any capacity working relationship with the government at this point? Are you involved in any way with the intelligence committee, the intelligence groups, now that you are no longer an official member of the CIA? I think that that's important because, if there is this shadowy place that we can get into, then I think that we're looking at that. John, I want to thank you for coming on with us. I think it's fascinating. And I want to have you back to talk to you about the Black Vault and other cases that you have going on.
Sure. Yeah,
And,
anytime.
And it's absolutely fascinating, the work that you're doing, and please keep it up.
I appreciate that. Yeah, anytime.
Work, you're a legend too. Like, I've been hearing about you since '96. This is really great.
Oh, hopefully it's good stuff you heard.
Yeah. I know. It was like this wonderkind, this child was, made this website.
Oh, that wasn't me. That was somebody else.
No,
Well,
that was you. It was absolutely you. I heard about you way back in '96 or '97. So
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And also remarkable that you're working on this to the Stars Academy project. We need that. That's the kind of investigation that we need. So thanks very much.
My pleasure. Yeah, thank you very much.
And we'll have you back on to go fuller into the stuff that you're doing there with Black Vault. And everyone can go to theblackvault.com to get more information on it.
I appreciate that. Yeah, anytime you want, I'll definitely join you.
Fantastic. Thanks, John.
All right, thank you.
Have a great one.
You too.
So we got into quite a loop there, but what did you make of all that?
Well, I love it that somebody is willing to do all that work, for one. As for, it's very interesting. It's someone who's been at it for 22 years and knows how to do this tango with Foia. It's phenomenal, and all the weird little things, the idiosyncrasies that he's learned about, and also the time periods, how policy sort of changes, and very interesting.
Absolutely remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So as we go into this next segment, I'm going to ask you to turn down the gain on your computer.
Me?
Yeah. Because I'm getting a little flat back. Yeah.
Is that better?
I think it's better.
I can barely hear you. I think. How's that? Is that too high?
Well, how are you doing? Are you able to hear what's going on before?
I can hear you.
Good. So I'm still getting a little bit of that, but I'm not sure what it is, but we'll continue to roll anyway. Start with what you were saying there about the moves that they might be making in order of saying who's behind the companies like Twitter, who's behind the companies like Facebook. And it actually might be a kind of a funded operation that came right out of intelligence.
Right. And I think, or else many of the companies that they acquire, because that's what they do, Google is now, under Alphabet, there are like 26 corporations, including Boston Dynamics, that makes the killer robots. I don't know if you saw the one where he's doing a backflip. That's a standing backflip.
Right.
So, it's maybe not even, but In-Q-Tel, I guess, is the CIA's version of, one of these incubators of DARPA. Basically, it's CIA's own DARPA, which is an incubator of, high-tech companies that usually create a weaponized version of something, and then they release it into the public. And the internet is one of them. The internet used to be called DARPANet, and the thing that has foiled the weaponization of the internet is business. That so much of commerce is done online. It's so important to money changing hands that it can't be totally messed with. It can't be brought down or whatever. It would collapse economies if it did that.
What's new about this revelation?
It's just, that it's very out in the open. Well, some of these, it's more and more. The fact that they're trying to make it be a good thing, censorship be a good thing. You know, it's began with the whole fake news business a year ago, a little over a year ago. And now it's just going to full on, you know, we have these very complex algorithms that can stop internet from propagating, you know, information from propagating on the internet before it even gets to our sensors.
Yeah.
You know, that the algorithm will nip it in the bud. And so they can just do that with anything then, anything that they want to stop. And I remember that, it was a joke in our office back in 2003, that when you would do a Google search on Dick Cheney, you would get nothing. They did that for a time. Like, he was like, God damn it, take my name, whatever. And you couldn't search for him at all for a while. And then it was like, this looks bad. You know, you have to let us put something up there. So, I mean, you're right. It's not necessarily new. It's just maybe what's new is that it's being publicly talked about in hearings, you know, and it's being published about. Whereas, you know, the weird thing I'm telling you about in 2003, there weren't any news stories on that back then.
Right. Do you think when you're looking at the stuff, then, you know, this kind of secrecy that was coming out here in the conversation with John, what's the impression that you get in terms of like Foia? You know, like, are we going to turn up anything about the program, the Academy to the Stars Elizondo program? Or has this been really just an exaggerated situation?
Well, it could be that Tom DeLonge is being set up to look bad, you know, to look bad. But I do think that there's something there to what Joseph was saying, was to privatize, to try to get all of this information and to privatize it, to make it an intellectual property and get it into that kind of IP kind of space, and out of the public realm.
Right. It's kind of fascinating when you think about it, because we're in a situation where, you know, we're getting more and more information about everything that they talked about. You know, the construction of it, one brick at a time, is falling apart. So there's no answers really about Elizondo. Now he's going out, and finally, Richard Dolan brought up the fact that he had a problem with what was going on there. And he said, well, you know, it's weird. He did an interview and he was saying how we didn't know anything about UFOs until this program. And, you know, Dolan was saying, well, maybe we should have sat him down and had a conversation about all of the different UFO investigations over the years. So it is really fascinating what they tried to accomplish, I think, with Elizondo. And I might be more suspicious of it because of the counterintelligence aspect. But even if you remove that, you know, and people want to say, well, they're trying to do the right thing or whatever, there's so many unanswered questions about it, you know. And I go back to Robert Bigelow, really, because Bigelow becomes the main source of, you know, he's the guy that Harry Reid was giving money to. He's the guy who supposedly has alien metals housed. That's ridiculous. If as according to the New York Times article, he was housing alien metals, there'd be UN hearings, you know, there'd be international bodies looking to examine that. So,
well, so the Bigelow's a private corporation, so there you go. It's been privatized.
Yeah, but if it was funded, true. But if it was funded under,
not with $22 million, it wasn't funded. That's the nuclear toilet. That's all that pays for.
Well, now he's the owner of Budget Suites. Okay, he's a billionaire. Bigelow Aerospace up there with SpaceX are two of the biggest. And you know, actually, one of the things he wants to do is create an inflatable space hotel by 2020. I found this very interesting.
Yeah, he wants to put those inflatable units on Mars too.
Right. How do you feel about this Partners United launch alliance with, you know, Bigelow? Now that means he's working directly with Lockheed Martin. Does that put a different spin then? We're starting to see, we're dealing really with Lockheed Martin here. And we know, if we go just through a little bit of a brief history, Lockheed Martin was the same organization that denied records to Catherine Fitz when she was the HUD director, and those were HUD records, and they handle most of the records that the government produces for these different things. So we're looking at kind of a government within the government right there with Lockheed, and here they are showing up on the UFO side. I mean, it gets to be kind of interesting. Now, another point that came up recently was that Leslie Kean was announced doing this movie with the guy who's in Traffic. I forget the name of the director, but they've now announced this big project, and they're going to do a book on her UFO story, which was about the military and UFOs. So they're doing this major motion picture about it. And the people involved in the movie are people that have been in government and been involved with these types of different things like Lockheed and HUD and what Fitz calls the HUD fraud. So everywhere we're turning now, we're seeing these government forces coming in around the UFO question. They're obviously angling, for certain type of disclosure on their terms, on the kind of CIA terms, on the we're heroes terms, the you're under a threat term. And this is what I think is the real most disturbing aspect of what we're seeing with it. And I think when we were talking to John, I was getting this impression that with the records he was turning up, nothing was really supporting the depth of the program. And when he was calling people in the government about it, about the only thing that they would confirm is that, eventually the name was confirmed, but not even in a document, but just over the phone. So I think it is bad news. And I think that John did an excellent job of laying it out there and trying to really be neutral on it. But even supporters now at this point are starting to look at that situation and say, what is really going on here? And the fact that the New York Times was coaxed into participating in it. Now, one of the guys who's supposed to be a spokesman for Ron Pandolfi, who's the major senior scientist at the CIA, who was involved in this early on, but is a critic of how they rolled it out now, and certainly doesn't have anything to do with it now, as far as I know. He came out with a big thing saying, well, there's several different things for disclosure that are being rolled out there, and that the New York Times intentionally kind of dropped the ball with this story. And Dan, Smith is the guy's name, and he runs a very interesting forum that gets into this stuff. He was saying basically the New York Times intentionally, burned their fingers on it, dropped the ball on it. That's the kind of impression that I'm getting also.
It's really weird. It's like doing these sort of weird, like the way a shark does a taste bite, is I think what they call it. They sort of do a taste, people die from those, but they're not really trying to eat you. They're just giving you a little taste bite. Exactly.
I think it's interesting. And I think that the more we look at Bigelow and his situation and all this, suddenly everywhere we look at with the UFO thing, we're looking at two things: billionaires and the CIA. And in between are these kind of like handlers, right? So we got Harry Reid from the Senate in the middle of it. It's like, do you remember a point in time when we were looking at something very different? It was a field of researchers and people who had these wild experiences, and they were trying to put together this idea of an ET reality. And maybe you had some, the culture was into it. You had things like the X-Files and all the rest of it. And so you built kind of a foundation there. And then all of a sudden, we now have this weird, freaky version of it where it's like the CIA wants to save you, and the CIA is going to save you from demons. And by the way, this billionaire over here is going to tell you that. This kind of burnt out rock star who's worth $80 million, he's going to tell you something else. So let's listen to all these big money forces and intelligence about the ET reality. Absolutely ridiculous frame of mind, considering for many years there's been a whole different thing on a more kind of grassroots level, which has attracted some major scientists, people like Stan Friedman and all the rest of it. Those are the people, and maybe they got to a certain point and they didn't get any further, but nonetheless, their information holds up as a good record for people to build on in the future. To go into this kind of strange billionaire, trillionaire version, flashy, oh, hey, it's going to be cool. You're going to be into disclosure. I'm a disclosure person, I mean, we're getting into a kind of ridiculousness.
Yeah, it's getting into the sort of Iron Man comic book.
Yes.
cosmology thing. Well, you know how I see it? It seems to be an attempt, because if you get out of the UFO ghetto a little bit and look in a wider field, I think that we're seeing a resurgence of Project Mockingbird. You know, the way that the CIA has really reasserted itself in the press, it seems to me, which is very evident to people who are anti-Hillary, and how the narrative about Hillary is not really what it should be. Like, what an incredible criminal, what an incredible arch villainess that woman is. How she's just skating away with incredible amounts of felonies. And meanwhile, Trump is getting excoriated. Not that he doesn't damage himself. I mean, he's got problems, clearly, but the way he's being treated. I mean, certainly he hasn't taken us to war. I keep saying this. He didn't take us to war on a lie the way W. I mean, W has, like, his approval rating is going up right now. How, you know, what planet are we on? So to get back to what I'm saying is that it seems to me that the CIA wants to reassert itself in communications. So it's totally taken control of the press, and maybe through, you know, this putting their spin on the UFO thing is one of, you know, part of this sort of multi-pronged project of theirs.
Absolutely. And I think that we're looking at a strange era here, and we saw a lot of it this week. And I'm thinking of calling it just the big lie scenario, you know, where it's like, hey, the big lie is out there. Here's another big lie for you. And we're getting it both on the mainstream side, which is lying, you know, to the public about a number of things. We're used to that. This UFO story was largely a big lie, let's face it. But also in the independent and the alternative, you know, I don't even know if you can call it alternative anymore, but this whole thing about releasing the memo. And, you know, we had this scenario where InfoWars said last week, we've released the memo, here it is, and Bill Binney is here to explain it. And they hadn't released the memo at all. It was a complete lie. I have no idea why they did that, but is this the kind of era that we're in, where you're just supposed to say something to get the ratings, to get the click, to provide the distraction?
Yeah, that's the horrible trap of the internet, is the clickbait factor. But
I mean, what did you think of that?
Everyone that I'm talking to is just like, they're overwhelmed. I am, and this was part of our conversation last week. Is the disinformation is just the noise to sound. You know, the signal ratio is so high right now. It's like, it's demoralizing. It's very hard to wade through all of it.
Yeah, there's no question. There's no question. I think it's interesting because the way that I look at it, we're in a position where, you know, let's take an example like that. You know, when that came out and you were watching it, did you think, oh, this is weird, that they lied about it? And what was weird was the other half of the internet picked up on the lie and said, hey, you know, they, on InfoWars, for some reason, they said that they released this memo, and they haven't. Everyone knew, but it was out there anyway, and they did it anyway, and there was never a retraction or anything. They just kept going. I mean, I don't get it. Is this like now it's the, you know, supposedly alternative media that's going to do the lying? I don't get it. I think there needs to be a kind of a base level of truth in these things. It's one of the reasons why I, you know, kind of got away from the mainstream media, is because I felt like they weren't telling the truth. But I think that if we get into the alternative side, lying for clickbait is also not a very good thing to be a part of.
Terrible.
I mean,
the thing is, a lot of people say that Alex Jones is controlled opposition, and they cite how he avoids certain topics, you know.
Yeah, I don't think we should take anything for granted in relation to this. It shouldn't be like, oh, well, I'm against the mainstream media, so I believe in that media. You know, I'm starting to think that what it has to be more like is these little oases. You know, there's a kind of a place you can go in this desert of disinformation where you get the information. And I would go, you know, to the Solari Report. I'd go to Giza Death Star. I'd go to Forbidden Knowledge TV. The stuff that we provide at Dark Journalists. You know, there are a number of sites. Cryptagon would be another one. These are the places where I know that I will get the truth and I won't be lied to. That's the same reason I won't read the New York Times thinking that I'm getting the truth. And I think this is very important. And it's a very important thing for us to put across, which is, you're not going to get that kind of lying when you deal with the people that I just mentioned. But for some reason, it was okay to lie this week about that FISA memo. on behalf of so much of the alternative side. I mean, was that as much of a shock to you as it was for me?
Well, it was, because actually my day began with somebody calling me saying, I've heard about this memo. It will absolutely prove that Seth Rich was murdered. It was a hit ordered by John Podesta or somebody like John Podesta.
Right.
And, that basically that's where WikiLeaks got, the emails and all the DNC stuff was from Seth Rich. So I was told that. He says, I don't know, I'm not saying, and I don't want to know where this person got it. But he says, if anyone in, the people that your chatter world releases it, let me know as soon as you find it. So then somebody sent me the Alex Jones, Bill Binney thing. And I started to then go to the, DNI site and download it to send it to him before really even reading through, assuming that this is what he had been talking about. Because I had to go out and do errands for a few hours, and I came back and I saw that and so I was just trying to do it quickly, because that was the first thing a call I'd gotten saying, I really want to see this as soon as you get it. So I was trying to get it to him quickly, didn't read it. And then I was like, wait, this doesn't have all this Seth Rich stuff in it.
Right. Yeah. And this is the problem that I had with it too, which is that it was advertising this whole thing. And then when you got to it, you're like, no, it's totally different. As a matter of fact, this document has been out in the public space since last summer. So that was a total lie. I mean, I don't think there's been no retraction. So that's even stranger. But maybe in this 24/7 news cycle, you just spit things out.
The memory hole. Yeah. I mean, what do we have? What do they say? Americans have a 9-second attention span.
Well, it's getting better all the time. It's going up to 10 right now. We have it though. We've got a couple of really good things to reiterate here. We're going to go into questions here in a few minutes. So everyone out there, thank you for being with us. And we've had kind of a wild ride right out of the gate tonight, which is fantastic. That's what live is all about. But make sure that you have questions and get them out there for Olivia. I'm going to reiterate a few points here about Robert Bigelow that I really want to hammer home, because we're going to do more shows about Bigelow and DeLonge and Elizondo until we get to the bottom of what they were trying to perpetrate, because it's very important. The op that was run, if we study it, we can learn a lot about what they do and be that much more prepared the next time. And I've found already, as I said, even people in the UFO community are starting now to bend against and away from the DeLonge operation, because there's too many questions. Essentially, this guy rolls out of some agency, says he's disgruntled, has these films. The films turn out not to be what they said they were. Last week, we went through the Goddard's Journal information. And the Goddard's Journal video basically debunks the New York Times video in terms of what they said it was. Certainly, we don't think it was a hoax video or anything like that, but it was camera anomalies, clearly, based on Goddard's Journal. And I recommend everyone go look at that New York Times UFO video at Goddard's Journal, because they did an excellent job, I think, of giving us the real idea of how that footage came about. And I think the way it was portrayed and the way it was conflated with Fravor's testimony, the Navy pilot, is really a mind job on us. And I think that video, right down to the slave on the side band, even though there's a good explanation for it, something very strange about the way this was all laid out. And so let's start with Bigelow real quick. Bigelow, 72 years old, has been deep on the UFO scene since the late 80s. He is kind of like a Trump type character in the sense that he came up through that hotels, and his investments really took off with that. And it was really the housing bubble that made him a billionaire. And I don't think he lies about that. I think he's a straight shooter in relation to that. I do think that the fact that he wanted to build Bigelow Aerospace, and they started that 20 years ago, and he wanted to get these hotels in space, that's his entrepreneurial idea. This is where he was going. But it is odd. Let's think of this, because those relationships, once you get into that and you're into UFOs and stuff, then you have to partner up with Lockheed Martin in order to get certain things done to go into space. And Lockheed Martin is a military contractor that has so much power in the government that at a certain point, we wonder, are we dealing with the United States, or is it the United States of Lockheed? We have to really look seriously at this question because of the amount of power and the danger that was warned. We were all warned by Eisenhower about this 50 years ago. And, when we take a look at those warnings and the subsequent things that happened when there was a power struggle in the government, it lends itself to say that these agencies and these military contractors got too much power and they wield too much power. And if they're allowed to wield that power in space, the idea of freedom on the planet is going to be history. We've talked to Elena Freeland extensively about the space fence that's being set up and how, it was basically an offshoot of Star Wars. It's been around since the 1980s, the idea of being able to surveil everything on the planet down to the DNA level. I think this is important when we see things about space exploration, when we see people who are space entrepreneurs, when we see the CIA question, when we see CIA people show up around UFO questions. We have to be more skeptical. We have to be absolutely adamant about the truth and what's actually going on. As it stands, the story that came out of the New York Times was largely false because, for one, Elizondo's story was ridiculous, which is that he was a counterintelligence agent who just got sick of it. We've already debunked it. He was there 5 years after he got sick of the program, supposedly. That's one. There are a number of bullet points associated with it. We just went through the Goddard's Journal video. Okay, so the story itself doesn't hold, but what does it tell us? It tells us that they're attempting to put this theme out there. What was the major theme underneath the UFO story? Threat, threat, threat. They wanted this to be about aerial threats. As a matter of fact, some of the major UFO investigators that were involved could no longer speak about the alien aspect when they were asked about it in these news conferences, which led me to believe that the people involved with them said, stick to the aerial threat theme. Don't talk about the alien part that you're so good at. Sorry, you can't talk about it.
That's what my threat, they want to keep it in, my source told me that the government stance, they want to underscore a threat idea, but they just want to keep the UFO thing in crazy land. They just want to stay in the cuckoo fringe area.
Right. So they can have this kind of thing floating around out there and saying like, hey, there's a threat and we need to beef up our budget against it. But God knows what they're actually planning. I mean, we're getting the very peripheral fringes of it. And they're using some good people to do it, which makes me doubly suspicious. But Bigelow, National Institute for Discovery Science, what is it that they studied? They studied Skinwalker Ranch. What was that about? I mean, I can give you a pretty good history on Skinwalker Ranch, but you want to take a crack at it?
No, you go ahead.
Well, Skinwalker Ranch, of course, is this ranch where all these paranormal things happen. And Bigelow actually wound up buying the ranch. But we have a combination at Skinwalker Ranch of poltergeist, ghosts, magical animals, UFOs, aliens, Bigfoot, everything is there. And it's all showing up at once. And good journalists like George Knapp got involved with it. And they studied it, and Bigelow's group studied it. And he wound up buying the ranch in order to study it. So it opens up this idea of portals, where there are these different portals where things from an interdimensional space can come in at different times. And the people who owned the ranch, I mean, it was a very legitimate story, Skinwalker Ranch. I've always been fascinated by it, and I don't blame him for doing some real study on it. But then again, when that gets twisted, we understand that the CIA documentary, the next thing that they're looking at for the UFO side is about these portals. Watch out, because that means they're trying to sell you an adventure story. They're going into Deep Space Nine. They're going into Star Trek Generations. They are moving this into a sci-fi fantasy land, as opposed to the actual real story, which I think bears looking at. But Bigelow himself, okay, so he's aware of these things. He does all these investigations into cattle mutilations. He does all these investigations into black triangle UFOs, which he ascribes to the government. He closes out the National Institute for Discovery Science in 2004, ostensibly because he's too busy with Bigelow Aerospace now. But for me, it signals a shift. And what happens is he starts to roll money into MUFON, and eventually we find out two interesting things. John referenced earlier this memo, the Airport Memo, and you want to reference it here, Alexandra, where you found out that they were submitting these reports. They no longer would take them from the Air Force. They just give them to Bigelow.
Well, yeah, this is in the, it's in, I guess, whatever the commercial pilot, their manual is that it's telling them, is it the FAA? I'm not sure if it's the FAA or if it's something else.
No, that's right. Yeah.
It's telling them to not report sightings to the FAA. It's to report them to Bigelow.
See, that's fascinating. For me, I think it says
Like
a lot.
anyone who has to, so anyone who's flying has to read the FAA manual. If they get to the part about UFOs, they're told to go to Bigelow.
Now, there was a kerfuffle with MUFON because he became their #1 contributor, but he made a condition, which is that he wanted all the cases reported to him first. And he wanted the power basically to veto certain cases from ever hitting the public.
Is he still underwriting MUFON? Because didn't you say that JC Knight was doing that?
Yeah. No. They had a kind of a parting of the ways, Bigelow and MUFON. But there was a time there where all of these cases, people would be submitting it thinking, oh, hey, I'm giving it to this public organization. They're going to help me out with this. And Bigelow is examining it. And now we find out in that same window of time that Bigelow was working presumably for this program, AATIP. So it's like a government role. So in fact, they're submitting things to the government that relate to the UFO aspect for them to check out, but they've got this intermediary, which is Bigelow, is this corporate thing in the middle that we can't get things like what John was doing, like FOIA requests to, because it's proprietary information once it hits the corporation. So people did have problems with that as it was discovered in time, but I think it gives us an idea too that, Bigelow came out in the summer and he said on 60 Minutes, oh, there's definitely ET life here. And they're walking among us now. I have no doubt about it. So this is where he's coming from. So, in relation to AATIP, if they have alien alloys and things like that, like they claimed in the article, which, by the way, I'm sure they do in the government, but I don't think they would be studying that through Bigelow's thing, because like I said, it opens up this huge can of worms. I think that was an aspect of the article that was also...
I'm not so sure. I mean, I disagree, because what I've been seeing is the way that the government, and it's in Philip Corso's book, things are released to private industry in order for them to be privatized, for them to become intellectual property and not subject to FOIA and things like that. Not
right, but here's but see, it's almost like we're talking on a first grade level when they give us the story, though, because let's think about it. All right, so the alloys and stuff that are supposedly being investigated by Bigelow, what's the actual fact? How many crash retrievals have we had in military circles since the late 40s? I mean,
probably hundreds.
Going by Corso's, he definitely said hundreds. So why would we need to study alloys that are flying through clouds, right? We'd be studying the crafts themselves. So talk about partial disclosure. That's a nothing burger.
Yeah. Oh, it's a nothing burger, for sure.
Yeah. So what is it they actually have, and why are they sort of even putting us? And there was another thing in the article where they're saying, oh, we're studying the physiology of people who've been close to these UFOs. And that's interesting because, of course, they would study that, because they'd be tracking these people. And we know that in the case of like somebody like Betty and Barney Hill back in the 60s, they followed them for years. The Air Force had meetings with them for years. And you get on kind of a target list, where they track you in these deep circles, deep in the military. When you
I heard a really scary story lately. It's from some guy who is, has been in the contractor community and has a lot of friends in that world. And
tell me,
they were talking about how, there was a big bounty on hybrids and how much effort. Didn't get to hear how much money there was, but that it was a lot of money. And he knows some. He's friends with several. And he was like, no, you can't. Those are good people. You can't grab them and turn them in for money. That's horrible. They're good people, was his position on it. But it was so interesting and freaky to get it from a very different angle. Like, I've been reading abduction literature for decades, but to get it from a friend who has friends who are contractors and want to go out and get hybrids for money to get paid was like a whole other, wow. That was like, this is not just some fantasy of experiencers. This is like contractors trying to get paid thing.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt if it was a proven thing that we had hybrids, there's no doubt that there would be people after them. I don't think there's any question about it.
Maybe there's something to be said for the secrecy there.
Well,
for their protection in a way.
Yeah, when you're talking, right, exactly. Well, when you're talking to these people, let's not forget, this is a very interesting story that Fitz tells, which is that in the late 90s, when they invited her to be part of this Navy think tank operation, and she was on the fence about it. She said, "Oh, I don't know if I want to talk." The Navy Defense Project, the think tank project, was all about if there are ETs and how the public would react to it and all the rest of it. And Fitz was like, "I'm not sure I want to talk about UFOs," which is hilarious considering later that's all she would do is talk about them. But they said to her, "Well, if you're on the fence, how would you like to meet some aliens?" And they wanted to set up a date with her to meet these aliens. So there are references in there that go all the way back to Val Thor and all that about these very human-looking ETs that are hybrids that are here. And I think it's interesting. Now, when you have this source that you talk to about it, and we've heard from people like Ingo Swann that they have these hybrids that are twin.
Like David Jacobs, who's talked to hundreds and hundreds of them.
Yes. And he's working.
Because I saw your interviews with him. It was a 2-part series, right?
Yep.
I saw that. I bought his book, and then I started hearing about this guy who has friends, and it was like they live 3 to a house. It was just like what David Jacobs said.
Wow.
And it's a completely separate source,
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, let's think about this for a minute. Jacobs, okay, is a professor. Jacobs has been doing his work around UFOs and hybrids since the Mac days, right? Or before the mid 80s, actually, is when he came around. That's 30 years of work. And when I was talking with him, he was absolutely adamant that this is what we were dealing with. I mean, it's kind of something to consider, regardless of what your position is.
Oh, it sure hasn't helped him. But, if you really look at who's helping to finance him and a lot of these people, it was all Lawrence Rockefeller. I know that David Jacobs was getting paid, some kind of grant money from Lawrence Rockefeller. Dr. Mack was. I think Bud Hopkins was. Who else?
It's true. Because, well, Lawrence Rockefeller is kind of a different case, isn't he? He
might have been off the reservation. I don't know.
Exactly. That's always been my impression, which is that occasionally you find these multi-billionaires who want to do something good for the world. It is possible for sure. But I do think that it's interesting when we look at Bigelow, really, we're seeing so much money involved around this UFO thing. And then when we see, organizations like the New York Times who are dedicated to propaganda, and they're kind of promoting this and they're seeing how far they can go with it. They haven't done a lot of follow-up, by the way. When you think about this story.
Oh, and the incredible amount of traffic. So, like, if they were really into clickbait, and if they really cared about getting traffic, they would do UFOs like 24/7 is what they would be doing. Because it was great for the site, for the traffic.
True. So what were they up to getting behind this, throwing it out there before the holidays so it could get washed away just in case? I think it's very interesting. You're in the middle of a psychological operation, and the guy at the head of it, really, in my opinion, as the front piece, is Elizondo. And Elizondo is a counterintelligence agent who's highly skilled in psychological warfare. So all of those CIA people creating this scenario, and then you've got, Lockheed Martin with Bigelow. Well, there's that. That's the end of that, United States of Lockheed. So, whatever it is about disclosure, we're not in a situation where we can have people like Robert Bigelow and Tom DeLonge and Louis Elizondo give us those answers because they're constrained by the agreements that they have. Suddenly, let's suppose our friend Robert Bigelow comes out and says, "Yeah, I know all this stuff." Well, you're not going to go up there and compete with SpaceX anymore because Lockheed's not your friend because you told the public about UFOs the way that we didn't want you to. So this is not the way to get at the truth. When you go for journalism, and I want to reiterate the principles behind dark journalism right here. Dark journalism is simple. There's an official story. That's one. That's what everybody gets. Then there's the counter story. That's usually brought in by researchers like you, like me. It's often called a conspiracy theory, but professors and researchers, the best people, get in there and they see the holes in the official story. And then there's the third level, and that's what we're dealing with nonstop since October, which is junk conspiracy. That's the third force. And that's where the story goes off the rails, where the crazy story gets inserted to get people off the track. And what I want to insert in there is the fantasy media, coming through in these different spaces about like justice fantasies, like, Soros's he's at Gitmo, and Hillary's at Gitmo, and all that kind of fantasy stuff. That's in the junk conspiracy too. But unless you get a handle on those three levels and are able to separate them to see which is which, so the official story on UFOs now, they're trying to move that official story into the threat thing. Before it's just deny, deny, deny. Now they're like, maybe we're open to a threat scenario here. I think that's important, and it's an important switch. So, I think when you get people that we're looking at, especially Bigelow, because Bigelow is part of that we're going into space. And there's so many opportunities in space that we're heading into. There's a space economy that we're heading into. The space economy involves space tourism. That's going to be big. And those people that are behind that have to work closely with those elements in the Air Force and with those elements in the military and the military contractors. And those people have been dealing and hiding that information about UFOs. And in the case of some of the clandestine organizations, killing for it. So that's not where we get our answers from, I guess, is really the bottom line, that we started off with John and we really have come full circle around to that. It's, where are you getting your answers from?
And whatever happened to that Dutch company that was going to Mars? Wasn't it like this year they were going to?
Right. Yes, I know. I heard about that too. And I do think that this is significant because we have the Chinese now. India has their own space program. They have their own moon program. This stuff is coming out of the box. The space stuff is right dead center. So let's take a few questions before we wrap up here. By the way, fascinating stuff, Alexandra. I really appreciate it. And John, earlier, wow, people should really check out the Black Vault because you do want to get at that information. Someone asked a question earlier when John was here, and I was talking about the Joanides file and how the CIA had hidden Joanides. And Joanides is a fascinating character. You and I went into him in a few shows, so people can go back to our JFK shows over November to get a feel for who he was. But they asked, where are those records? Which is a good point, because all the records that are coming out that were mandated by Congress, since no one knew who Joanides was, those records weren't included in that, which is why Jefferson Morley, the former Washington Post reporter, is suing the government, the CIA, to get those records. So somebody asked, where are those records? And the answer is the CIA has them. So that's an important thing, and it's a good case to keep an eye on also. And, it's a lawsuit that's been running for 12 years, so it's not like it's wrapping up anytime soon. But I think when they hide things on that kind of a level, and you have people moving forward, a former journalist that's a former mainstream journalist, and Peter Dale Scott at one point joined that lawsuit. Those are the things that we really should get behind, because I think you get some historical answers. You start to understand the framework that you're walking in. And with that, Olivia, I'm going to ask you, you've been working with everyone out there, and we have a great crowd tonight, very interesting and very curious. What is the kind of impression that you're getting?
Okay, all over the place. New Guard Network has been asking lots of great questions. The best is, how do we force Bigelow to talk? Force being the key word.
Alexandra?
No, if he's a contractor, he's signed non-disclosure stuff. If he wants to keep contracting and keep in business with the government, he can't talk.
Yeah, it's a good point. I would say as a corporation, though, like any corporation, if they get enough flack from the public, they'll feel compelled to make a statement, and you can shake them up that way. I prefer to just have a guy like Bigelow come on a show like mine, and I'll ask him very directly and very honestly what he's up to, and he can give me his answer.
Well,
but
he seems on the face of it to want to talk. He seems to want to.
No, I would agree. Maybe there's a way to, have him come out and talk about it in a way that doesn't blow his security secret detail cover, because the way that the story sits now, I can tell you right now, if I was their PR people, I'd be giving up, because that story is not going to hold. Nobody's going to buy the Delonge to the Stars Academy. The stock aspect is funky. The New York Times story is funky. The footage was debunked by Goddard's Journal. Elizondo's story is, completely unbelievable. And so, the whole thing, if that was cooked up, as a rollout for disclosure, really, then they did a terrible job. So I would think somebody like Bigelow would take me up on my quest to have him come on this show and talk about it and straighten it out. Why not just come out and straighten it out? Take 45 minutes of your time and we'll happily have a gentleman's discussion about it. I think it's a good idea, but it's a great question because the point is, how do you make people go the extra mile? How do you force a corporation to deal with a particular issue? Certainly if they had, you have all these things going on like Me Too and you have, sexual harassment things. Now all these companies have to adjust their sexual harassment policies. Well, maybe that's a good thing, so that's the way it happens. It's kind of a public move. And I think in situations like this, they just have to know that somebody's paying attention. I think that's the first rule. Okay, what else?
Okay. Jello Putin says, is there any Skinwalker Ranch evidence that's credible?
Oh my God. The whole thing is credible, I think, from top to bottom. What about the, ethereal wolf thing that everybody saw? I mean, no, the sightings and the poltergeist and the tests around that ranch, there's no question there was some completely paranormal thing going on. Alexandra, you were kind of quiet in that section about Skinwalker Ranch. Do you have
I never really looked into that one. I don't know what happened there.
Well, I will say this, that Knapp was really big on it, and I bet that's where he met.
What was the year that it happened?
It's the mid-90s, yeah.
Mm.
And the story was very peculiar. As a matter of fact, Knapp, they sent him out there in all this gear, he was supposed to be the test subject. So if poltergeist broke out, they could monitor him and he had sound stuff and video stuff. But no, there's enough, I think, to that. I would investigate the case. I think it was absolutely the real thing. Oh.
Does DJ remote view?
Well, I've tried it. I've had some of the best people give me instructions about it. And I think it's fascinating. I studied a lot of the work of different psychics over the years, and I've studied the work of Edgar Cayce and people like that. So we know they go into these trances and they go to these different places and view things. But I think anyone who's ever had a prophetic dream or thought about somebody and then they've called, or they're aware of this link that we're not just here. So I would say the answer to that is yes, but I wouldn't say I have anything much beyond that to say, because there's probably better remote viewing material out there than what I have so far. But I absolutely think it's real. And for my conversation, if you go back, it's very interesting. I did an interview with Russell Targ, and he put me on the spot in the interview because he asked me right there to start remote viewing the object he was looking at.
I'm glad you're telling it.
Do you remember this?
Yes.
I was like, oh my God, this is going to be terrible, because if I get it wrong, it's just going to be ridiculous. And it's a fascinating little thing. I could blow the outcome, but basically I was seeing George Washington. So I figured it was a quarter. And what he was looking at was a face, like a distorted face in a magnifying glass in a circle. So he broke it down for me that I made it through my own personal associations into George Washington. I made it into a quarter, but basically what I was seeing was an old man in a circle. And this is how they do the remote viewing process, which is they take you and they tell you to get rid of the noise.
Yeah, rid of your interpretation just to get the raw data of what you're seeing.
Yes, exactly. But you've had psychic experiences also.
Tons, yeah.
That's something that is
it's routine. It's like almost every day is something. Yeah, I mean, I don't even think there's anything unusual about it. I think it's totally normal. It's totally a part of what it is to be a sentient being.
I won't even tell you what kind of psychic impressions that Olivia gets, but she knows who's going to show up. All right, what else?
Okay, so Nicholas asks us to talk about the elongated skulls.
Well, Alexandra, start with that.
Well, I think it's fascinating. I know that they've just done new work, L.A. Marzulli, with Brian Forrester in Peru, where I think it has the highest concentration of these things. They are found all over the world, but they're from Paracas. There was a cave in Paracas where they found over 300 of these skulls. I've been to Peru, if anyone else has. I mean, most Peruvians are pretty, the indigenous Peruvians can be very diminutive, very small statured people. But these 3,000 or 2,000-year-old mummies were from 6-foot sized skeletons, and then their skulls are much bigger, and then the location of where the skull connects with the spinal cord is in a completely different place. It's much further up in the cranium. You know, it's called the foramen magnum, I think, and that's
fascinating. Well, we have seen, you know, and von Daniken is somebody who's talked about this and said, you know, his assumption was that these people at one point in South America saw aliens, and then when the aliens left, they try to make the skulls of the kids imitate.
Well, some of the skulls that you find in all the museums over there have been cradle boarded, and they have had their skulls done that to them. But these are completely different. These are genetically different. I'm not sure what the results are yet, because I think you have to pay. You know, it costs a lot of money to sequence 3,000-year-old skulls. It's not like doing a 23andMe DNA kit. It's more complicated because the material is old.
And by the way, I'm going to demonstrate the dark journalist formula here. Okay.
But let me just finish. Also,
yes.
The density of the bones of these Paracas beings is totally much higher density than human bones. They're not human. Not only that, the suture that how the skull forms, it's missing. It doesn't have a hemispheric thing going down like that. It's like one thing there. So it's totally not human.
Well, that is fascinating. But then, of course, we remember these pictures of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and they are, you know, sitting there in these royal chairs, and they have these incredible extended skulls.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some theme there. But, you know, the official version on it would be like, oh, you know, it's just some.
Well, what the Peruvian government says is, how dare you desecrate our cultural inheritance? You know, it's basically stay away when it's clear that these are not Incas. These were not Incas.
Yes. Excellent point. So then that would be like the counter story, what you're saying. And then the junk conspiracy would be the Gaia mummy. See?
Right.
See how that sneaks in there and takes the theme? This is what we see over and over again. That's the third force that moves in and says, oh, look.
And I got suckered in because they're like, well, you know, we're going to DNA test, and, you know, if they're fake, we'll let everyone know. So I was like, oh, okay, well, they're really, you know, they're being honest. So I ran their video, and then there was never boo coming out of the, you know, that they were gone.
When I saw them bragging about it in their third quarter financials about the amount of subscribers they got after they ran their Nazca mummy story, I was like, that's all that they care about.
Well, as I think I've told you, the corporation Gaia is, and who owns them is, it's MCA or what, Universal, and they're screwed. I mean, they are both companies. The company that bought them is in debt and running at a loss, and so are they.
Is it Vivendi Universal? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. And no, there's no doubt they're running in debt. I absolutely agree. And I always thought it was very strange, you know, that they were coming out with these things. But we saw something like that the year before when they came out with the Roswell mummy. And that wasn't a Gaia project. That was somebody else. That was Jaime Maussan. But the way that they ran with that thing, and then it turned out to be a complete fraud. It was some kind of carnival thing. But you got all these people on board with it. It almost destroyed careers, right? With some people who had done fairly good work before. So you have to be. This is why the Delonge thing is so important for people to look much deeper than what they're saying on the surface. But the UFO circus aspect, that junk conspiracy, really wants to pump this up. And it's starting to fall into that category of like galactic ambassador land. This is a very important place that, you know, we don't want things to go into. You know, you want serious research on this stuff to be a kind of a legacy that we take forward. And I think it's important because you'll get to the truth that way. The way that it's going, I think what we're looking at is these people will cash in, you know, the contact in the deserts. They're going to cash in on the Delonge style circusy stuff. So we really
they have Corey Good again this year.
Yeah. Well, there you go, right there.
But yeah, the Paracas skulls is a bona fide
Yes, and that was a great answer on that, and I absolutely 100% agree with you. There's something very mystical going on with those skulls. There's a practice back there. It possibly even relates to opening the pineal gland, and that whole third eye imagery that we see could have something very much to do with these native practices.
Well, the natives emulating them, the Paracas, the real ones, that I think they were born like that. They have actually one of the mummies is an infant that died, and it already had, it didn't have time to be cradle boarded.
Oh, yeah. No, I see what you're saying. No, I absolutely agree that there was a genuine model that was like that. And then
not only that, they had very fine red hair. It's unlike anybody who lives there, Nobody.
Well, that's interesting too, because when I think of red hair, I think of the Vikings, right?
Right. So it's a very different, it was not coarse, thick, black hair. It was very fine, very different kind of hair.
Fascinating. Olivia, you're at bat.
Okay, Josh Randall. I wonder what Alexandra's estimation is of how many CIA and the like PR people there are in Hollywood. I've heard that the biggest group in the government are PR personnel.
I wouldn't be surprised. I would not be surprised at all. I would probably say maybe even that the majority, of a large amount, maybe half, a very large amount of people, where the really big money is. Absolutely. And I've background in PR, and they're, high level, like it's called public, it's not public affairs, it's public affairs is corporate government interaction. So it's when corporations are transnational, and they are making, because they're in different jurisdictions, the laws are different. So you can, for example, like a big pharmaceutical company can get a drug approved in France, maybe before in the United States or something. So there's a huge business that deals with government corporate communications. And I know people in that field, and a lot of them, come from, kind of a spooky background, or at least, associated with that world. So
it's fascinating. Yeah, it is. Great answer to that. I totally agree.
Okay, this is a big one. Discussion opening up here. FKN Freddy, you guys ever think that everything may be a psyop, from Q to UFO to FE, like all the fringe stuff?
No, I think that's the demoralization campaign. That's why we're getting swamped with so much disinfo right now. It wants to make you think, UFOs are a psyop. Everything's a psyop. Not everything is a psyop, but there are psyops to undo real things, important events that could change everything, like UFOs, like the Paracas skulls, like the pedophilia, that could totally ruin careers, ruin whole levels of industry and governments. That if certain information got out, so that, it has to be spun by whatever counter-terrorist means necessary.
No, I absolutely agree. The point is, you have to be able to sort the good stuff from the junk conspiracy. Just like if somebody comes up to you and wastes your time talking about flat Earth, they're wasting your time. So the flat Earth part, that gets us into that sort of psyop type reality, even if it's an organic thing.
Oh, it's organic. People believe that, and it's, they'll
well, it could have been
until they're blue in the face.
Yeah,
as course as possible.
Yeah, we have to remember that people like to argue too. But let's get them arguing about the good stuff, right? Argue about important things. That way, if we have argument, I think it's important. One of the key things that I don't think that we see around, let's say, alternative space, the alternative space, or the UFO space, there's not enough critical thinking around it. Let's face it. They accept things on the face value. It's the new theme for the month or whatever. And it winds up looking pretty silly. And a lot of the Q stuff got into this realm, Q saying, I'm raising an army and stuff. I mean, it's anonymous posts on a web board. What's happening to our discernment?
Well, this is, I think Americans, or everyone, wants things to be easy. They want it to be instant and easy.
Yeah.
And so you get that with Q. You get, it's not like everything is this or everything is that. No, you have to work and you have to get in there and dig. And
absolutely. And look, it should be civil discussion. I think that that's the important aspect, which is when you lose the civility around it, it's just noise, right? So you need a civil discussion, but you need absolute debate. You need argument. And that's what's missing in so many of these rollouts. Olivia.
Okay, Looney Tune. Thoughts on a pre-Diluvian society that could have been more advanced than our society now?
No question. Wow. This is a conversation that Alexandra and I have a lot. And, my answer on this is going to be to get Alexandra to talk for 2 minutes about the Basque.
Sure. Okay. The Basque are a linguistic isolate. They're in northern Spain on the border on the Pyrenees, but sort of on the coastal side, but not quite. They didn't get the coast. They're not allowed to get the coast. But so straddling the Pyrenees in southwestern France and northern Spain is a group of people who speak a language that's linguistically not related to Spanish or French, basically, or to anything that was there before, which was Celtic and sometimes German stuff. So when they do, what's very weird about this population is that they have the highest percentage of Rh negative blood of any ethnic group on the planet. And some scientists have thought maybe this is sort of a pocket of Neanderthals, because Neanderthals were Rh negative. And so what are Neanderthals? Well, Neanderthals were hominids that were here before Homo sapiens. And they predate and were living alongside Homo sapiens. But what happens with Rh negative populations is that the body, like when a woman gets pregnant, if she's Rh negative and the father is Rh positive, the first child will be okay, but she will develop antibodies against Rh negative genes. The next time she gets pregnant, she will have, if there's no intervention, she will miscarry all subsequent babies. And so this has had an effect of basically it's genocidal for Rh negative people until the advent of modern medicine, when they were able to try to manage this during pregnancy. So that's why there are very few Rh negative people left. And that's why the scientists think that this group that the Basques represents maybe like a final enclave of Neanderthal, who they're also saying might not have been so totally different. They would maybe pass.
Aren't the Basque also unusual for the area? Aren't they tall and blonde?
No, I don't think so. Not particularly. I mean, there's a pocket there because there were lots of Celts there too. So
interesting. I will say this on the whole antediluvian situation. I think that Casey's work around the Two Eyes Stone, which was the fire crystal that the Atlanteans had, that basically powered their airships and gave power to the entire continent, and that was set in reverse and caused the destruction. That story was so edgy and fascinating from when he told it, which was the 1920s, and it was so advanced that it reads more like a modern story now. That's such an edgy story, and Casey is known for Atlantis, but he's not really known as much as he should be for the high-tech elements that he described and what they did. And he did describe a group of Atlanteans going with these fire crystals to the Pyrenees, and that they didn't make it to Egypt, that they settled there in the Pyrenees. And I've always felt the Basque are probably the best remnant of Atlantis that we have.
Right. I mean,
great question.
An ethnic isolate. I mean, they want to be independent. They keep on, fighting for independence. They have a radically different language that is not related to any other language on the planet. And that they're near the Atlantic coast. I think that they've lost, the Bay of Biscay is that body of water right there on the western, coast of France and northern Spain. So it was, they're known, basically most of the populations, the Spanish populations of like Cuba and other like Venezuela and Argentina are very heavily Basque.
Right. Fascinating, Olivia.
Okay, Dirty D dialect. Does Dark Journo think the Great Pyramid was built using godlike / alien tech?
Yes. Well, certainly it was not built with slaves. And, you know, all of the incredible researchers around that, like Graham Hancock and John Anthony West, they've proved that it's certainly, the official story on that is completely out. Also, the dating on the pyramid, if you really go back in that time, and this does bring us into Steiner's work and Casey's work, who placed the pyramid more in the 10,000 BC range, 10,500 BC range, because now we have the archaeoastronomy that could tell us what the pyramids would have been looking at, what the Sphinx would have been looking at, and it makes more sense.
Yeah, well, and the geology and the weathering from when it was still raining, because it was the end of the last ice age.
Yeah, and that's Robert. Well, that's Schock and Bivol, their work, and their work holds up. I mean, it is the most powerful thing that's been done around it. But in terms of how they were actually made, I absolutely believe that they had powers in those days from these groups, from Atlantis and from Mu, that could float incredible weights. And we've seen it over and over again with these monuments. No one knows how they're built. It's because
they're all over the world. I mean, Peru's full of them. Mexico's full of them.
They have a relationship to matter that is different than what we have now. I don't think there's any question about it. But, you know, did these groups get together and levitate these things into place in a ceremony? That feels more right on to me. They have found, as of November, this shaft that's in the pyramid, and it's past the Grand Gallery and going into the King's Chamber. So that is very interesting. That's a story to keep an eye on. Next.
Okay.
We probably have time for like...
Let's keep going. This is fun. Okay, Colonel Angus, what about that military base in Florida, Jackie Gleason's story, I think it was?
Yeah.
Was that in Florida?
Yeah, it was. It was.
Oh, really?
In a nutshell, basically, Nixon took it upon himself to have Jackie Gleason with him, and he drove to this base. They escaped the Secret Service. And as the story goes, now it's interesting because, well, first of all, Jackie Gleason took him to view aliens at the Air Force Base in Florida. And, you know, Nixon did like to show off, and he certainly liked to impress his celebrity friends. But Jackie Gleason's ex-wife said that Jackie Gleason could not eat for 3 days after that. And you think about the incredible appetite of a guy like Gleason. So certainly must have been powerful. And
why couldn't he eat?
What's that?
Why couldn't he eat?
Well, think about it. He was so freaked out that he was nauseous for days.
Ooh.
Yeah. But he said his basic description was they look like children, which you could think when you look at an alien with the way that they're described, the grays, they do. I mean, they're small, so they look like children. But a fascinating story. Do I believe it? Absolutely. And strangely enough, it was Gleason's wife who let the story out, his ex-wife. And it's just that kind of a thing. You know, it's just that kind of a thing where you really see it. But also there are, as we know, a real hardcore, there's a hardcore history of aliens being stored at bases. And there's a story about Kennedy not being able to get at these things and just showing up at that very same base one day, surprise inspection, you know, because they wouldn't let him near the UFO file. And when he shows up, he does a review. He says, I want to see what you've got. He walks around, he tours the aliens, he leaves. And it's a way of asserting that commander-in-chief. Again, one of the things we even talked about there with John, and I've gone into at length, is this. We have to understand that power struggle around the alien file, around the UFO file, between the presidency and the deep state. And the deep state primarily represented by the military contractors and the CIA. But great question, yes.
Okay, Terry Tolkien is just dying to find out, did DJ receive the original image of the Zuma mission patch that I had Dr. Farrell forward to him?
Thank you. I did. I've seen 3 now, and I'm guessing yours was in there. So it is fascinating, and I think Joseph was trying to get our attention to what they were putting out about it, and Mysterious Universe ran that. Somebody else sent me another kind of more standard patch that was around it, and I do think it's interesting. It's an interesting thing.
Were they all the same? Were they all brown with a fleur-de-lis instead of a Templar cross?
No, there was one that was like a weird half and half thing that was even stranger. It had a planet and it had a flag, and so that's probably the official one. There were there are weird things around it. I'm going to go into that in depth and to find out where the provenance for those. But I do think, look, the Zuma thing was a weird story, and I'm still working on it. And if you get into the South Africa aspects, I will tell you that President Zuma is so closely associated with the space program that, you know, he's basically like the major U.S. partner for space at this point. I have no doubt.
Convicted or something?
What's that?
Didn't Zuma just get convicted?
Yes, they're trying to throw him out. He's been convicted a couple of times. They threw him out as deputy president in 2005 for his association with the major arms deal. And they called the arms deal the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was the same name that Reagan gave to SDI. So there's a lot of weird connections, but our whole space thing is going into Africa. And that's something that we're presaging in our conversations here. I have no doubt about it.
Truth Templar, has DJ and Alex heard of the Bosnian Pyramid, Sun, and the Moon?
Yes. Yes, I have spoken, communicated with Sam Osmanagic.
Yes. Well, yeah. He is. That's his project.
Yeah. And I don't know what to make of it.
Well, he has the dating around 30,000 BC, as I understand it. And the structure is ginormous. It could be, it looks like just a mountain on the outside, but he has a whole study body there. And I think Graham Hancock has a saying, which things just keep getting older. And that's the mentality I think we need to keep in mind. These things are showing up. They just found a jawbone in Africa for modern human, which is 200,000 years old. Okay. Previous to that, they thought the modern human was in that 80 to 90,000. And so that's something that just came out 4 days ago. Every time we look at this stuff, it's getting closer and closer and closer.
Oh, yeah. I think when I first, when I was a little kid and I first heard about Cro-Magnon men, they were saying that Cro-Magnon existed 35,000 years ago. And that's, probably did exist 35,000 years ago. But now they're saying that they just found a fossil in Israel that was 175,000 years old.
Yes, yeah, and Israel, for some reason, is an incredible place to find these.
Right, it has all kinds of hominids, and yes, so that's just, and this is a fully formed Homo sapiens, so it's very much out of Africa. So now they're saying that there looks like there was a previous out of Africa. Wait,
yeah,
the discovery was.
Yeah, see that
Africa that we normally hear about, which I think was 50,000 years ago.
Right, exactly. Okay, so let's say two more questions.
Couple more. Okay, Melinda Sifford. Hello. Do you have any thoughts on all the booms happening? And then there was a follow-up question. Does it have anything to do with CERN?
Booms?
Yeah, there's incredible booms that are going on around the world, and in America, where these towns will just hear this incredible noise, sometimes this grinding sound, and they can't figure out where it's coming from. And Linda Moulton Howe has done extensive research on this. What I would actually say is I think it's related to the incredible infrastructure that's going on underground, and that once in a while, these things have to bleed over, and there's no explanation for it. And very often, it's around earthquake activity. So, you could say it's related there, but then there are times when the booms happen and there's no earthquake action. So how do they account for that? For a while, there were trumpet sounds going, right? If you
I was going to say, I remember that. I've seen there's a whole genre of YouTube videos about the weird trumpety kind of sounds, and they're weird. And just throwing it out there, not that I don't know what to make of this. I don't know that I believe it, but I've heard somewhere it was something like it's some kind of an interdimensional thing.
Absolutely. I think that these things happen for a reason, and I think it very well could be. I think the practical down-to-earth answer would be that there's extensive underground infrastructure going on, and that's my best take on it. The CERN part is interesting because I keep trying to convince Alexandra to write a book about CERN because she's just the woman for the job. But we've done some shows on CERN with Joseph Farrell, and I absolutely think that their testing the medium there for interdimensional activity. And I think the strangelets that were involved in the court cases where people thought that this kind of process would start because of CERN, of these black holes opening, as much as that can be overblown and stuff, and we don't want a big, there was some really Armageddon style action on that. But the truth is, there is something strange about it, because later the scientists admitted, well, okay, but there's such an infinitesimal chance of these strangelets happening that we didn't even bother to really think about it. But nonetheless, there was a chance of these black holes opening as a result of CERN. And Farrell has pointed out that the budget of CERN is $6 billion, which is more of a military-style budget, and also that CERN is a sovereign entity, which can't be sued. So those are pretty powerful reasons to look deeply into it and not trust the official story on it, and not also go for the junk conspiracy.
Okay, big question. The number of alien species.
Isn't that interesting?
I mean, it would have to be,
Let's go through the ones that we know real quick.
Mm.
Greys.
Greys.
Pleiadians. Or Pleiadian Nordics, right? That's 2. People talk about.
I don't know what to, I don't know what to believe. You hear about the Orions, you hear about the Lyrans, you hear about Syrians.
We the Arcturians. Remember that book?
Who are not, they're like in 5D, they're not physical. The Andromedans, who are also sort of not really in our.
I think that gets closer to it. Yeah, I think that gets closer to it. I think what's important about that, I think there are many. I would put it to you that way. Absolutely. And but what I think is interesting is you have done a lot of research around Ashtar Command, and that always struck me as interesting.
I think that there you go. I mean, it feels very CIA-ish to me, the whole Ashtar thing. I mean, really, it's a bunch of space fascists. It's a bunch of space Nazis. He's
You're
like
right.
the commander. It's like the command and whatever. It's like, ew, gross.
I know. It's like, oh God, what's this, Battlestar Galactica? What's going on?
Horrible.
Okay, that was a great question. I would say this, that I think primarily it looks like, in terms of the alien types who visit Earth, it looks like Greys and Pleiadians would be the primary, they're the ones that we see the most, we hear the most stories about.
Right. Just in ancient, going back to Celtic mythology, the Kelpies, if you get into Celtic mythology, the Kelpies sound a lot like Greys.
Interesting. I remember that Graham Hancock, when he was doing an ayahuasca trip, said that he saw a Grey, which is interesting because he's not big into aliens in his waking state. So there's that interdimensional.
Anti-alien, anti-UFO, isn't he? He doesn't like that stuff.
Right. He's really, it's nothing that he would get into.
Not his thing.
But he sees that when he goes into those DMT states. So when he did those experiments, that tells you again, I mean, is it interdimensional stuff that we're dealing with there? I will say that there are stories, though, when you go into the Australian stories of some of these abductions, the Greys that show up there have these red eyes, and they're aggressive and stuff. They're very different from what you hear about in others. So I don't know. There seems to be like a landmass.
Yeah, no, because I've heard about red-eyed aliens in Brazil too.
Yes.
The Virginia case that Mac was.
Yeah. Yes.
They had red eyes, and they were brown aliens.
Yes. I think that's interesting. What's that?
They had like a different shaped head.
Yeah. I think there were enough witnesses around that. And apparently one of the original officers who showed up and touched it died.
Mm.
So, what I was going to say is, when you want to watch for alien stories and major cases, watch South America, because that seems to be where the activity is. From what I understand, in the United States, it's very hard for these craft to get around because of the intense military attention on them.
Do hybrids know they're hybrids?
Do hybrids know they are hybrids, Alexandra?
Yes.
Was that a question aimed at Alexandra? Do you think Alexandra's a hybrid? Is that what you're saying? No comment, Alexandra. I'll be your PR agent on that one. People attribute things to Alexandra all the time, probably because of the book she's written and the fantastic things that she's talked about. But they've attributed her to all kinds of different unusual aspects around the alien thing. I'll leave it right there.
Okay, what books are you guys reading right now?
That's an excellent question. I am reading a book called Pyramids in the Pentagon, which is a Nick Redfern book, and it's fascinating. I'm also reading his book about early 1950s contactees, which is fantastic. So I'm doing some Nick Redfern reading right now.
I stopped reading books. Terrible.
What was the last book that you wrote?
The last book that I wrote?
Yeah.
Was 2012, Science or Superstition.
Oh, yeah. I love that book. I think that's right neck and neck as your best book.
I worked hard. I mean, I was given 6 months to write it instead of 6 weeks. So, yeah, it's got more.
It's a little bit better. Yeah. But is there anything that, let's say, is in the zeitgeist that you've been paying more attention to, whether it's movie or book, or just gives, I think people are trying to get an idea for what they should think.
Like topic or area. To me, I think that really the thing that I'm kind of is my thing this week that I'm very obsessed with is really, I would like to know, I want to know the history of how did Google and Facebook and Twitter become, when did they really become co-opted and part of, this kind of fascist control state apparatus that they are?
No question. That's a great question. And we definitely will take that into an episode on its own. I've been reading a lot about thought forms too. And I was thinking of doing a show where we deal with that, because I think it's very important. What I'm seeing now is a lot of the thought forms that are being thrown at us are either disaster movies, or in many cases, we're seeing these thought forms thrown around, even the Q revenge fantasy stuff. Everything is kind of a heavy negative thought form. And I don't think that's a good way to start the year off. So I want to direct our attention to thought forms. We'll do an episode on that. But yeah, it's a great question.
The zeitgeist that I'm feeling lately is that it feels lighter. It feels more positive than it has in several years to me. It feels like there's more possibility for change, for positive change, than there has been in a decade, maybe, or more.
Yeah, well, maybe that's why they're throwing around so many negative scenarios. It's quite possible. All right.
That is pretty much the end of it.
Fantastic.
Questions. That was great.
They were great questions. Excellent. And of course, Alexandra's stuff is at forbiddenknowledgetv.net. I recommend everyone check that out. She's, it's an incredible site and it's an incredible resource. So do yourself a favor and go there and sign up for the free newsletter. Get that information and learn about the work that she's doing. Of course, the blackvault.com is, we had John Greenewald on earlier, and he just gave us a titanic amount of incredible info relating to the documents that he's kept on that site. Almost 2 million documents. I mean, just
incredible amount of work, incredible quality of work that he's done too.
I mean, weigh that out versus some of the other things that we see in the space, and there's such value there. And I think that's what we need to do, is we need to move into those oases, and
he's a legend, that guy. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, right. But I'm saying that there are just these places where you can go and get this information, and it's available to you in many cases for free. And I think you should support those people, support this show, support Alexandra, support the Solari Report, Giza Death Star. These are the things that will grow and will really give you that kind of payoff in terms of the information that you get. So you give them the ability to give you the service and cut out the noise. I think that's important. And there's all kinds of different ways to help get the shows around, to share the shows and the things that we do here with Dark Journalist, with the incredible guests that we have, and the incredible audience. You guys were great tonight. Fantastic crowd.
Can I ask one last question?
Yes.
Okay.
Wait,
so,
it's an Olivia question. Hold on.
Well, no. It's actually, this is from Zora Dax again. DJ, do you think the old book, The Secret, has any credence? And I actually would love to know what Alexandra has to say on this also.
Oh,
Alexandra, you did a book on The Secret, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. And okay, well, I think that the the original book is, I think it's called the Emerald Tablet, something like that, the Emerald Tablets, and which to me seems to have a spurious provenance, but apparently it's real, and apparently it was something that Isaac Newton read, and Isaac Newton was an alchemist. He was into alchemy. I think that there is, from a cognitive psychology point of view, I think that if you change the way you see the world, different opportunities become visible to you, and you can act differently if you take on a different point of view. So I think changing, your attitudes and your cognitive psychology is, to make your life better, is something that you can do without any circumstances doing it for you. Obviously, sometimes circumstances will force you to, like, I got to get out of this mess. I got to start changing, and then you'll change. So I think that yes, you can change. And that there's also things like Cliff High and things like the Princeton, whatever it is, the peer thing, has shown that human beings can actually change slight things with like almost what is it when you can like levitate things with your mind.
I think it's called levitating things with your mind.
No, it's like
psychokinetic, yes. Psychokinesis.
Telekinesis, that's the word.
Right, you've got it.
So I think that, we do have slight skills in that arena, not massive skills, but slight. So yeah, to some degree we can change our lives. We can change the way our lives are by changing the way we think. Absolutely. And maybe that is a secret. It's a secret if you feel resigned. It doesn't seem possible if you're in a resigned mindset.
There's no question. The mind is the builder. This is what we know. And we'll close today with a Casey quote, which is spirit is the life, mind is the builder, and physical is the result. So that's the way I look at it. Fantastic information all around. And thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We, of course, will be back next Friday. And we also have a Catherine Austin Fitz coming up on Dark Journalists next week that everyone can look forward to. Our subscribers just got part 2 with Joseph Farrell. And we look forward to seeing you. Go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. That way you keep up to date on the shows and you understand the events that we have coming up, and especially the live shows, which we've been keeping pretty much to a steady schedule of Fridays at 7 p.m. Eastern. So thank you so much. And thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
We'll talk to you soon. Have a great evening out there, everybody. It's Friday night. Bye-bye.